Welcome everyone. Welcome to the tower at UNN. As usual, today I'll be your host. Today's topic, we're going to talk about it slowly, but we're going to go furthermore into it when time goes. Just first of all, of course, want to send out greetings to everyone out there. I hope that everyone's doing all right. I hope that the day is going right. I hope that this week has not been as hectic as the previous week, or if it has been, that you have managed to overcome with new ways how to overcome situations and get better at doing it. So greetings to everyone out there. Today's topic, we're actually going to be talking about the Lost Revolution, and we're going to be looking at what happened after the post-independence struggle, not only in Uganda, but we're going to be looking a little bit more about also what happened in Morocco, and we're going to be talking about also the price of the ticket and what happened with the rise of Obama to presidency and African people globally, what this meant for African people and what it has meant for African people. So we continue with the topic. So I want to start out first by introducing, of course, the topic for today. As I said, we're going to be talking about the Lost Revolution and the price of the ticket. And in the Lost Revolution, we're going to be talking about the return of the Sultan. This is in Morocco. And we're going to be also looking at the return of the Kabaakas of Buganda. We're going to be looking at both of the returns of the Kabaaka. There is the first one, whereby the Kabaaka was returned after independence. And then there is a second time when the Kabaaka was returned by Museveni. So we're going to be looking at both scenarios, and then we're going to also look at a little bit, because we're going to compare, contrast, and then draw connections. As the caption says, what links us is the political question of the African, be it in Mozambique, be it in South Africa, be it in Africa. The dignity and the self-determination of the African remains a political question that links us all together as Africans. So before we dive into the topics, I want to draw reference to the two things that I'm going to keep referring to and where some of the research has come from. If you have time and you want to dedicate time to this, I recommend reading a book called The Price of the Ticket by Frederick C. Harris. It talks about the political arena for Africans in the Americas and what that has meant in the light of course, African independent politics that Malcolm X was looking for versus the assimilated Black politics that Obama represents, not only for the Africans in the Americas, but for the global African and also the Africans on the African continent. And then another paper that is the bedrock to this presentation today, or to this show today, is the paper called The Lost Revolution by Mehdi Ben Barak, who is a writer from Morocco, and that's going to be what we're going to be looking at today. So before we start, I want to start out with a video of the return of the Sultan before we actually go into any more details. This was the return of the Sultan in 1955, and we're going to go back to that time, and then after that video we will see the return of the Kabaka, before we got independence, and then we will continue from there.
On his way back to the throne of Morocco, from which the French deposed him 2 years ago, the Sultan Sidi Ben Youssef returns to France from his exile in Madagascar. Time and place of his arrival were kept secret, but with little avail. Moroccan leaders are there to greet him, while in Casablanca, joyous crowds celebrate France's recognition that only Ben Youssef's return can bring peace to Morocco. Ben Arafa, the Sultan France tried to maintain on the throne during Ben Youssef's exile, has now abdicated. He is received by President Cote. At French Foreign Minister Antoine Pinet's official residence, Sidi Ben Youssef arrives to discuss his restoration with the minister through an interpreter. Morocco's internal problems remain to be solved, but the chief bone of contention between Morocco and France has at last been settled.
So welcome back from that short video. It's showing, of course, the return of the Sultan from exile back to Morocco. And on that video, of course, it's recorded by the British. And at that time, Morocco was a colony of the French. So the French decided, in order for them to have an easy way to give the Moroccans independence, was with the return of the Sultan, because of the sentiment that the Sultan held. But it wasn't only France that did act like this, because in Uganda's case, the British deemed that in order to easily give independence to Ugandans and to make it in such an easy way that they would continue to meddle in Ugandan politics, that was by the return of the Kabaka of Buganda, which also happened. That's why the next video that we're going to watch before we go into the topic, we're going to also watch the other hand that, that we're more familiar with, the return of the Kabaka of Buganda.
King Butisa II, Kabaka of London, to fight the government's decision to exile him from the little province that is part of the Uganda Protectorate. The King's insistence that Uganda should be an independent state, says Colonial Secretary Oliver Littleton, violates an agreement signed by the Kabaka, who is now the centre of a parliamentary controversy.
Looking back over your exile, do you feel that your time in England has been completely wasted?
No, not at all.
Do you feel that your country has gained or lost by the recent constitutional changes?
I think it has been, definitely.
You feel you've come nearer to being what the Western people consider a democracy?
Definitely, yes.
And what effect do you think your absence has had on your country's progress and prosperity?
I think it's tended to make it a little better by way of economics, and certainly politically, they haven't made the strides that one would expect in 2 years.
Do you feel that will be remedied now?
I hope so, sincerely.
What will be your first task when you get back home?
My first task would be to sign the new agreement between the Majesty's government and the Buganda people.
And I understand that some of the chiefs and officials over there who've remained loyal to the British government throughout this crisis are going to be rather severely dealt with. How do you feel about that?
That I wouldn't know about, but I'm sure it's quite wrong.
Are you going to cooperate fully with the British government tomorrow?
I'll do my best.
Abaswera mu bwa kaloke kamu mulimu batanganya ngamba mwe mulimbo abaswera mu bwa kaloke kamu mulimbo abajoga banabwe mwe mulimbo abakyawa banabwe kaloke kamu mulimbo abakyawa banabwe owange mbo abaswera mu bwa kaloke kamu mulimbo abatanganya ngamba obono mwe muli abaswera mu banga ekibuga kya Mutesa Kabaka na Bulamba ni Nakawa kyababulira olugendo lw'omwami ekibuga kya Mutesa Kabaka Banda ni Nakawa abali abangi nsigadde bomu akaloke kamu akalo mbakalo komwami akaloke kamu kitanga kalo ekyembabulira abalenzi okwekala omulungi kwesengereza sabanza olw'okukwataka kuwata basira mu bwa akaloke kamu mulimbu abatanganya ngamba ekyembabulira abampirira abalenzi ekibuga kya Mutesa Kabaka wenda Bulamba ekyembabulira abali abangi nze nonsigadde bwe nti ekyenkuwulira wulira ngenda abangi okwekala omulungi kwesengereza sabanza olw'okukwataka kuwata basira mu bwa akaloke kamu mama akalo kembuga akalo kole ekibuga kya Mutesa Kabaka wenda Bulamba abange munda basira mu banga titi
na monyo.
So as we can see, in 1955, the French and the Sultan of Morocco back to Morocco from exile. And the same situation was happening in Uganda in 1955 with the return of Kabaka and to his throne. And Kabaka was in exile asking for the independence of Buganda, which is a nation. And similar things can be said about the composition of what is Morocco today, because different nations and nationalities were in the region and put together because of the greed of these colonialists when they did come into contact with the African continent, and still the greed that is actually behind all their investment and interest in the African continent, and the rise of puppets such as Museveni and all the likes of people who are meddling and claiming to be politicians and Pan-Africanists at that state. So firstly, before I start the show and get into, the meat before the bone of the show, I want to say, today, the African Union finally did something that is for the African people. It is with sadness that we celebrate such an event, but regardless, it's something to be celebrated. Israel had requested to be an observer for the African Union as they reach agreements in regards to African people. And Israel had asked to be an observer. First of all, Israel in it of itself remains, its status as a state remains a debate, and my politics can only allow me to ally with the freedom and liberation of Palestinians from the grasp of the imperialist desires of Israel and who backs it up in the United States. So today, the African Union rejected Israel's request to be an observer during African Union meetings and African Union negotiations. So we take that as a victory, small as it is. But if the pressure of our people together, we can stay tuned in and we can put pressure, we can change the tides for African people, not only today, but for future generations to come. So as we go into this paper, we're going to be looking at lost revolutions. And please remember in the back of your mind the context that we're talking about. African countries are fighting for independence and liberation. Politics of liberation and emancipation are all over the place, not only on the African continent, but amongst Africans who are not on the African continent. It's happening in the Americas. It's happening everywhere that we have some colonized peoples. The war on Vietnam also comes about this same period of time. Colonized peoples are looking for self-determination, are looking to govern their own selves, to govern their business, to govern their states. So it is within this context that the Sultan gets brought back to Morocco, and in Uganda on Buganda's sake, the Kabaka gets brought back. So we're going to look at what Baraka says in his paper to the Lost Revolution. Why is it that when incidences like this happen, it becomes something that we call a lost revolution? So we'll go into the first bit. So here it says, since I advise you to read this paper. It's not very long. The paper in it of itself is about 6 pages or 5 pages. We can post it. If a lot of people are interested, please do let me know in the comment section, and I can make sure to post it after the show on our social media platforms so that you can have access to it, the PDF of it all. But in the paper, there's a bunch of other factors that did play a hand, but one of them, this is the third one, and it was, since the speed of political radicalization and the ideological crystallization that results from the former increased as the struggle advanced, our struggle entered a third stage, which is in conclusion of the movement within the framework of a North African revolution. This was in fact a quantitative change. The means existed to go beyond the original objectives of the 3 countries. By the 3 countries, we're talking about Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. And in this, the writer goes on to say, The means existed to go beyond the original objectives of the three countries, which ranged from the sentimental demand for the return of the Sultan to the creation of a national state, passing through the restoration of national sovereignty. So it's the same situation where we have in Buganda. Kabaka Mutesa was asking for the independence of Buganda as a nation, but the sentiment of returning Kabaka Mutesa led to, again, the reinstatement and the creation of Uganda as a nation. So the return of Kabaka Mutesa wasn't to give Buganda independence, which was what the Kabaka was looking for, but it led to the creation in the post-independence of Uganda as a nation. Similarly, in North African politics, you had Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. Parts of all those countries were one, and they were ruled by the Sultan. If some of you know your history, and it goes back to the Maghreb, and those parts were ruled by a sultan who governed all of them, but they had strong political hold in Morocco. So the sultan returns and becomes the sultan of Morocco, and it goes into national politics other than what the struggle was before, which had to do with North African politics. So we start to see things change once our sentimental value is added to them. As people trying to liberate ourselves, our sentiments are exploited by our exploiters always. So it goes on to say, this was in fact a qualitative change. The means existed to go beyond the original objectives of the three countries, which ranged from the sentimental demand for the return of the Sultan to the creation of a national state, passing through restoration of national sovereignty. Beyond these apparent differences, the sameness of colonial oppression in each country and the unity of the anti-colonial struggle could then be perceived. The revolutionary importance of unity in the struggle is that it reveals the similarity that basically exists above and beyond superficial differences due to the historical colonization, the political regime, and the degree of intelligence of colonial officials. This unity of action should, in the long run, destroy many myths and illusions. And then the writer goes on to say, these are just parts and bits of it that I thought would add to today's show. So I add reading of the whole paper. It was the end of this brief period of national struggle that all of phenomena developed and created great confusion, as has happened in other revolutions. As a result, Mohammed V returned from exile, signed the agreement of Siele-Sayet Claude. Doesn't that mean that the enemy, more experienced than we, understood the trend of events better and more rapidly? So also in Uganda's sake, if we go back and revise what happens, Kabaka Mutesa returns, signs an agreement, becomes the first prime minister of Uganda. We still have this situation whereby the enemy is always understanding our reaction and making us reactionary to actually the change that we need, that needs to be revolutionary. So the writer goes on to say, as to the agreement, we should not concern ourselves with false problems such as, could we have refused it? Because we could not have refused. When the writer says this, it also rings a bell in my head. When we think about it, could Uganda have refused when the British handed down the independence agreement with the return of Kabaka Mutesa? No, we could not have refused that. We believed we were getting independence. So we should not tire ourselves with questions of, could this agreement have been refused or discarded? Because that is not the bigger question here. But the question should be, as the writer continues, why did France accept it? Why did the British accept this agreement? I think these are questions that we need to keep on asking ourselves. Why is it that countries that have colonized us, countries that continue to exploit us, countries that have supported Museveni, why are they accepting the political arena as it stands today? Why are they pushing for change as it stands today? You can't support Museveni for 35 years and then say you're the biggest, if all of a sudden you care about human rights and you want to support opposition in Uganda. These are the questions we should be asking ourselves, you know? And this has been happening over time. We're talking about a time in 1955. Why did the British accept to give us that paper? We can talk about, oh, they did not want to fight more, but why was it a lot easier for them to hand us that paper? Where did we lose out? Where do our enemies stop us up? The United States cannot support Museveni throughout his presidency and be the one avenue that we can look for self-determination through, and be the country that is supporting that is lobbying for the change of political change in Uganda. Unless we're talking about Ugandans in the diaspora in the United States, but also who is actually supporting them, who is financing them, who is financing our struggle. Those are questions we should ask ourselves, because why would they agree for a change and on what terms? So here the writer goes on to say, why did France accept it? The only question that should concern us is to measure the impact of this agreement on the revolutionary drive of the national movement. And that's an important question. What did the agreements that we got on independence after Kabaka Mutesa returned, what was the impact of them? And in the bigger question, what was the impact of the agreements that were drawn between Museveni and, of course, the current Kabaka of Buganda? What is the impact that they have? What were the promises that were made? Later on, we're going to see another video where promises were made and have not been achieved. What is still the impact of such a relationship to us as not only Baganda people from Buganda nation, but as Ugandans? And then how does it impact the revolution? For example, we talk about the struggle now and how the struggle had always been, and we talk with people and the struggle, we were looking in the light whereby we were waiting for an American ship to, go into physical combat on the ground and rescue us, but that did not happen. But what is the impact of these ideas of waiting for these countries to come and play a role? What impact does it have? And what impact have they had historically? Because if we look at the history behind it, we can look at the contradictions and then start actually defining answers that will help us. So it goes on to continue, because the question, at least in the question of Kabaka Mutesa, Buganda never got its independence. Uganda ended up getting its independence, but what has that done to Buganda in the bigger picture? Then you have President Obote who comes in and attacks the palace. Then you have Kabaka Mutebi being a prime minister, not of Buganda, which he wished to be, or to remain just the Kabaka of Buganda. He becomes a prime minister of Uganda, which again puts pressure on all these orchestrated and fabricated lack of unity schemes that the British have planted throughout colonization. The British made sure that the North was well trained, and the people from North were used in the military, in the police, and then in the central, in Buganda. And by the North, I mean Acholi State, Lango State, and I'm talking about West Nile. They were the individuals that were taken into, combat training prior to us getting independence. And then we actually never got independence. I hate to use that terminology, and then in Buganda, we had the training and the raising of the technocrats. But what happened to all the other regions? What happened to Busoga? What happened to Bunyoro? What happened to Ankole? Those are all things we should look into. But then what happens when a lot of pressure is put onto Buganda nation wanting its own independence and making the Kabaka of Buganda a prime minister, but he did not demand for the independence of Uganda, but from the independence of Buganda nation from the colonial structure, which is Uganda. And that could have also been done by all the kings of the other places, by the chiefs of the Acholi region, by the leaders and the traditional leaders in the West now, in Lango, in everywhere, in Sebei. So we're led to believe that we have no way to fight for our own liberations in these things. And now we're still locked into this, into the pettiness that the British constructed these countries with, the pettiness that the French constructed these countries with. You know, it starts to put pressure on that fabric. So the writer continues. No one can deny that the conjunction of liberation movements, Algerian and Moroccan, and the situation that might have ensued played a role in the sharp charge of French policy, or similarly, that it was no accident that that at that precise moment, when the militants were only beginning to see behind the symbol the meaning of national struggle, the colonial power suddenly grasped the emotional significance of the Sultan's return. This is a coincidence which, upon analysis, gives a retrospective strength to colonial policies that we were far from suspecting. And this is a very important part. Just when the national militant movements of a place, because in 1961, if I'm not getting my years wrong, we have what is known as the Kabaakas crisis. And when people become militant and start to tire of the political situation, the aggressor will always get something sentimental and give it back. For Museveni, it was the return of the Kabaka, because Museveni knew he could not win the military struggle by himself. So having the Kabaka of Buganda and returning the Kabaka of Buganda was of importance. For the British as well, the return of the Kabaka from exile was of importance. They make it seem that they are returning something to us, which is of sentimental value. But yet again, that is also done to control our minds, to control the masses. And I think that takes me to the other topic of the day. I want to look at the other book that was suggested on there was a book that is called The Price of the Ticket. So what happens with Africans in the Americas? We're referring to, of course, if we're to call it the United States of America. What happens with the politics there when you have politics for African people in the Americas, where they're not looking to be Democrats, they're not looking to be Republicans, but they are more interested in actually having independent African politics? What happens to actually give sentimental value to something that will only further assimilate them into the system of Americanization and American imperialism and American genocide? The only way that they can do it is by leading to the rise of the first African American president. So in 2008, Obama rises to power, but when Obama rises to power, it's far away from all the politics of African people in American politics. When you go back and look at it, and I advise you, if you could read that book, if you want to read that book, it's a good read and it gives a good base of history around African politics in the United States. Africans in the United States were not looking to be Democrats. Because today, we look at the political arena and we think, oh my, if Africans in the United States are Democrats, those are the good people. If they're conservatives, those are not the good people, because conservatives are a certain way. For the matter of the truth, there is no difference between Democrats and Republicans. They all serve the interests of the American state, which is built on white supremacy, racism, capitalism, and it will never drift from that. Their interests are not the interests of the people, but the interests of the system that has been set up for its founders. Similarly, the same thing happens in the UK, where you have the Labour Party and you have the Liberal Party and you have the you don't have the Liberals in the UK. You have the Labour Party and you have the Conservatives. Yes, the Labour Party might have started, for the workers, but over time, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party still serve the same needs, still serve for the class survival of the people that exploit more than half or 3/4 of the world today. So then the main question here is the question of group survival. Why do we always let our individual sentimental value dictate how we act, instead of letting the principle of a class survival dictate how we act? It's not. And this is not to say that the return of the Sultan should have not happened. The return of the Kabaakas should not have happened. But why is it that when we enter a struggle for dignity, for self-governance, once we're thrown a card of sentimental value, we will look away from the survival of the class, of the whole group? And by class, I'm talking about most of us being workers, most of us being exploited, in one way or another. Like the group itself always seems not to survive, but individuals end up surviving from this schema. And the enemy has used that not only once, not twice, but continuously uses it, that it is now a cycle where we are left to dictate we're left to be reactionary to whenever we start a revolution. We start a revolution, and then all of a sudden we all have sentiment to 30 noob 30 noob seized peoples, but we cannot even speak of all the other foot soldiers that have been put behind bars and tortured. If we're given one person, that person counts for all the thousands of noob children that have been taken away and put on shackles and tortured and thrown. We forget all those dead bodies that have been dropped in Mulago, some that we don't hear of. We forget all the mothers who were crying on TV about their children just because they gave us 35. That is enough. That is where our sentimental value is. But we are not even looking into, as a group, how are we all going to survive? How do we push this revolution to be for the whole group and not just for individuals? This is a problem that's not only happening in this point in time. That's why I brought the historical context. So that some people do not start to speak out of context. Because what I've realized, people love to speak out of context because it's convenient. It's convenient to speak out of context, huh? It is really convenient to do that. But once you start to contextualize things, then you start to see the bigger picture. The contradictions start to appear. And when contradictions start to appear, our emancipation as a group becomes very important. And then once you understand those things, then you have to start making decisions, not based off of a sentiment. A sentiment will play a role, because the major sentiment is, love for liberation and freedom. And we are fighting for liberation and freedom. That sentiment will drive you. But not only that sentiment, it has to be a mixture of everything else. And we have to think about group survival other than starting to think about the survival of only a few. And we do it, what is painful, we do it at our own cost. But different people do it differently. Whereby some people will do it at their own cost because they're not being affected. And other people will do it at their own cost because they don't know better. And for some people, it's easy to just be indifferent. So, Obama rises to power. Africans in the Americas have been fighting for independent politics, independent African politics, not the assimilated clownery that we have now with democratic Africans and Republican Africans. Whatever the words and the conjunctions that are made in African Americans or this, it all comes down to the same. We're manipulated for not pushing for class survival, but individual survival. And that is the cornerstone of capitalism, because we want to participate in capitalism the same way how capitalism participates with us. But again, you can never destroy the master's house with the master's tools. So the other question I want to ask everyone who's on here, then it starts to make sense. Why? Savior of Uganda at that time, 1986, Museveni brings back the Kabaakas of Buganda, reinstates the kingdoms. It no longer becomes a surprise, but it becomes the template that is being used back and forth. Because the question was never, the question even that Kabaka Mutebi rose, that Kabaka Mutesa rose was not his return to Buganda. Kabaka Mutesa said he wanted Buganda to be independent. And this is a request that not only Buganda was entitled to, this is a request that Bunyoro is entitled to, Ankola is entitled to, Acholi State is entitled to, West Nile State is entitled to. The liberation of all suppressed not only nationalities but also ethnicities in the colonial fabricated states remains a question that we must deal with, a question that we must interact with, because it goes back to the primary question of production, and that is the land. So then I go back to the issue in the United States. So Obama rises to presidency. Here we have a picture of former President Obama and President Bush, giving a visit in Tanzania. So what did it mean for African people, not only on the African continent, but in the context of uh, of African people in the Americas? What did it mean for us when Obama rose to power? Well, it meant a lot of losses. AFRICOM is set up on the African continent, whereby you have soldiers and Africans who are being trained by not only the United States of America, but France, Britain. And these are people who are being trained to keep the political fabric in place. You have companies that are being built in African countries to make drones, because the Americans knew, sorry, I have forgotten the country off the top of my head right now, but this is because the Americans knew that there was nowhere else in the world that they could start manufacturing drones that will actually go into places and kill people undetected without it being in Africa. So many people have gotten drones striked, but drones are something you can go and buy off the internet if you wish to, but it's a military weapon. It has been militarized and used not only to kill African people, but colonized people all over the world. Obama rises to power, and all of a sudden, it seems like Africans in the Americas have gone back to the 60s, almost not just the 60s itself, but back to the 70s. And we have movements that are rising and high level of police brutality and hyper militarization of the police itself, because police has only been militarized in the Americas. And again, on the African continent, you have the training of Africa. Shouldn't this tell us more about the militarization of this imperialist interests that keep on happening? You're given a sentiment, and then they go and strategize and get the military set, so that when you rise up again and realize that this sentiment did not reach you to the liberation that you desired, then the military is there to push you back. And then you're given another sentiment. I don't know if when I put it that way, it's making sense. So a revolution starts, a sentiment is given back. After the sentiment is given back, because, it's to exploit that sentiment. For example, the return of the Sultan, the return of the Kabaakas, sentiment is given back, oh, this is enough. Or the return of, just a few named people who have been captured by the police, but we don't even have a record of how many people have been taken in by the police for supporting NUP. We don't have a number to tally how many people have been killed, how many youth have died because of their support for political change. And not even just to look at NUP, FDC, we still have people who are political prisoners in the Congo. We still have political prisoners in Uganda itself. None of them have been accounted for. None of them have been asked for. None of them are remembered just because we're given the lead of the opposition back. Like, they arrested Besigye and we got Besigye back, and that's all we wanted. So our parents started looking for more change. But no one asked for all the other ones who had been behind closed doors, because survival of the group is not important. Because we see survival of the group as important if our leader survives. But what leader can lead you without knowing that the survival of the group is important and that it's the leader's responsibility, if they have decided to lead, to demand for members or missing members of the group? Not only demand, keep a tally, know, inform, be involved with, put pressure on, and be adamant about every number, every person, every individual who has not been accounted for and has been taken by the aggressor. But here we have leaders who are the leaders, they get returned, and they sometimes never speak of all these other people. But we only hear about a few. That's my thing about Ugandan politics. We only hear about the headliners, the writers, the academics. But how about the youth who are involved? How about the youth that we also being grabbed off the streets? How are we so, we're always so, and I commend them for bringing that up. Don't get me wrong. We commend them for bringing that up, for pointing that out. Yes, put pressure, add these names too. It doesn't refuse to add the other names as well. At least let other people know the numbers so that we can put pressure on those numbers. But it's becoming a story told again and again, not only post-independence, but it's becoming the regular politics. Add sentiment to one event or one individual, give the individual back, and voila, liberation is attained. So as we continue, I want to pull up another video for today. And we're going to look at this video as well. And then we'll come back and then we'll go through this again.
In 2009, President Yoweri Museveni met Kabaka Ronald Muwenda Mutebi at the peak of the strained relations, barely after he was blocked from visiting Kayunga district, which lit the spark of the Buganda riots. It was the last time the two officials met. However, the relations have since thawed largely under the reign of Katikkiro Charles Peter Mayiga, who prefers to use soft power in his engagement with the central government. This culminated into a memorandum of understanding where government agreed to return some of the properties which were taken from Buganda after kingdoms were abolished by the Obote government. In 2014, over 200 land titles were handed over to Buganda. The king, alongside Prince David Wasajja and Katikkiro Mayiga, paid a visit to the president at State House in Entebbe. The kingdom spokesperson Nua Chimba confirmed the visit, which he says was premised on the unfulfilled promises.
They discussed a wide range of issues, and as Buganda, the 2013 Memorandum of Understanding hasn't yet been fulfilled on the side of the government.
According to Chiyimba, Mengo is not happy that whereas the land was returned, it continues to be utilized by government.
Kati ettaka lino mu bitundu ebimu libadde liddukanyizibwa government, local government. Era kati nga ndowooza ensonga ezisembeyo zibadde buddu nga bakyagenda mu maaso n'okugaba liizi ku ttaka lino. Newankubadde ng'erimu ebyapa bibadde byakomawo.
Ground rent, commonly known as Busuru, is yet another point of contention.
For renting Machindye barracks, there is this court down here, and also Chigo, and several other properties that were occupied by the government. So, of course, out of that, there is some money that have been received, but there is more that we expect from the government.
It's not clear whether this phase of negotiations between Mengo and the central government is under new terms beyond the provisions in the 2013 MOU. Solomon Kawesa, Unn Tv.
Well, I don't know what happened in 2009 with the Kayunga riots. It was not surprising that the presidency of Museveni went on to change international attention by drafting what was to be known by Ugandans, the anti-homosexuality bill, to grasp international media's attention and change it from the demands that were being made by Buganda at the time and build that whole narrative. And it's not surprising that it was conservative, what are they called, evangelicals in the United States that actually financed this, gave a lot of money. Bahati got a lot of money from this. I'm not even going to put an honorable to his name. There's no honor in these people. And made a lot of money, tens and thousands of dollars, and lived off that. But what happens to the Ugandan people? What happens to the unity that we must have as Ugandan people? Not only in Uganda, but also in Buganda as a nation itself, and Ankola as a nation itself. What we have happening to Ankola region right now, or Chigezi even in itself, you have some few people who have benefited from the regime and are rich and have a lot of money, who are part of the building of the dynasty. But yet again, not everyone is benefiting from this. Other people are not benefiting from this and remain impoverished. Their land remains stolen, taken away, and you have them also further deteriorating. So what happens to the unity within these nations, within them themselves? In Buganda, you have the same thing. You have people who have become very rich, people who are given money by the government in Buganda, just to do the puppets work, to report, to be the backup. For example, you saw Maiga talking about how he actually prefers soft power. What is soft power with the central government? Why should Buganda as a nation have soft power with the central government? But anyway, that's besides the point. It brings us back to the point of today, contextualizing this to where we lie as a people now. What is group? We should start thinking about what is, by the way, these messages that I sent today, I want to make it very clear. It's not to call out any political actor. It's not to call out any political participator. It's never about that. It's about you who's watching. It's about you who participates, the indigenous person. We ought to know this. This ought to be important to us, because at the end of the day, the Kabaka of Buganda could, God forbid, but for example, if I use the example of Kabaka Mutesa, again, what happened in 1966 with Obote, the Kabaka was no more. But the people who make Buganda what it is, the Baganda people, you were still there. My grandmas, my grandfathers still were on that land, still paid homage to that nation, still practiced with that within the lineage of that nation. They still existed in that politics of Uganda as Baganda. So Buganda was still there as a nation, even though the Kabaka again was exiled by Milton Obote. That is why it's important to us. Because when we start to talk about the emancipation of these indigenous nations in Buganda, in Ankola, in Chigezi, in Bunyoro, in Busoga, it is the indigenous people who are going to rise above and demand for their self-determination. And as the Baganda, when we demand for our self-determination, we can then demand for the reinstatement of the Kabaka of Buganda as the leader of Buganda state. It's not the Kabaka who's going to demand for our emancipation. It will be great if the Kabaka can join along for the ride. It makes it easier, I'm not going to lie, to back up his people. But even regardless, if the Kabaka doesn't join, it is the people of Buganda who are going to ask for Buganda's liberation. Because when Kabaka Mutesa went into exile again after Milton Obote, Buganda still existed. That was symbolic. The return of the Kabaka by Museveni is symbolic as well. The return of Kabaka Mutesa by the British, symbolic. The return of the Sultan, symbolic. The return of the few members who were taken away by Nup, symbolic. But they are not only symbols because it comes from the pressure of the masses. That's what takes them out of symbolism. But what puts them right back is the masses is then manipulated off of sentimental value, not to think about we still have a bigger picture to get to. So, as we speak about what we want out of this, we must think about not only our survival, but the whole group's survival. And what does that mean? To start separating, but mixing sentiment with everything else that comes with it. With logic, reason, and strategizing is important and key. We must know that our emancipation as African people comes by the identifying and reconciling. We ought to reconcile indigenous nations that have been captured and put in fabricated colonial states, and the federal governance of those nations alongside each other, because unity is also key to still fight against. And if we're going to be anti-imperialists, because if Buganda stands on its own, it can be manipulated by, it can easily be reconquered as they did in the start. Why is it that Bunyoro was conquered? The British came and said, oh, Buganda, we will give you protection. Because Bunyoro and Buganda were strong and they were going at it for a long time. So the British knew if we go to Buganda, which is just slightly at this point in time, a little bit stronger than Bunyoro, they almost are conquering Bunyoro. All they need is our guns and gunpowder. And talk to the Kabaka of Buganda, you know? Then from that, we can get Buganda to then capture Bunyoro. And we've already captured all the other ones. Why give ourselves headache? You know, with Acholi State, it was easier because all you had some places where it was one chief that had all other chiefdoms, and then some places you just had small chiefdoms. So you go there, you conquer one at a time, one at a time. There is no sense of unity within each other. But Buganda also has clan based. You have all these different clans coming together as one nation. So it's a nation. Bunyoro is a nation as well. So the only way to make it easier, they were to use Buganda nation to conquer Bunyoro nation. So this is how it was done. This is how it continues to be done. So unity is important. But to have unity, we must recognize our indigeneity to a certain extent. We must pay homage to it. We must pay respect to it. We must reconcile it. Because the issue that is important to it is, of course, the question of the land. Till this day, we're still arguing about Milo land. This was being argued about in 2009. When Museveni brought back the Kabaka, it was to settle all that, give the land back. But it never got done because bringing back the Kabaka was symbolistic. It had sentimental value. It put Museveni over Kaira just one bit. It gave Museveni the ability to go and start waging a war in Luero. And he couldn't even take it to Chigezi, where he says he comes from, or Ankwale. But he could start it in Buganda because he brought back the king. Buganda, please. So when we speak of these things, we ought to go back, however painful it might be, and start to remember these things, and start to think about these things, and start to question how we give sentimental value. But the bigger question is group survival. Because if we don't survive as a group, there's no way we're going to make it to where we need to get to. And that, as I said before, we have to reconcile for the benefit of the land, for giving back the land for proper productivity, and then we have to be unified. We have to be unified as one. So as we bring this to an end, I want to go back to also another thing that we've been talking about throughout this, is where you have now, I want to take it back to the case study of the Africans in the Americas, is where you have now Africans in the Americas who at a certain point in time, regardless of if they identified as Democrats or as conservatives, or as Democrats or as Republicans, there was a certain point in time whereby the laws, the Jim Crow, genocidal and racist and white supremacist laws that were set in hand unified them as one. But when that is taken away, and when we live in an era whereby an African president rises to power and is the president of the world's strongest world, we start to actually lose a sense of what the revolution is. You sit back and you feel that you have arrived. But African people, we have this saying, if he's winning, we're winning. You're not. You're not winning. I won't lie, I was amongst those people. Oh, like Obama is the president of, like we have a black president in the US. We have made it far. We have reached far. But in the backdrop of that, you had a lot of Africans still being killed by imperialist wars. You have Museveni selling soldiers to go fight in Iraq and Iran. You have imperialist powers in the US they don't even send their own soldiers. They start to buy soldiers out of African countries. Because in Uganda, for $300, you can get a soldier from Museveni's regime. This is documented. You can go watch an Al Jazeera documentary about it, and it's about it's the child soldiers who were used, and the same child soldiers are being resold, thrown away. Or the Middle East needs labor, use African people. Why are you struggling? Europe needs labor. We can get some African immigrants, or not only from the African continent. When I say African, I mean African people all over the world. Get some people from the Caribbean. The US needs, we'll give some Africans visas. But what happens to Africa? What happens to the African nations that exist? These nations existed with systems of their own. After all the interruption of Europeans, regardless, African states existed. And they still exist to this day. So let us not see assimilation into the imperialist world as a gain, as a gift, as a win. Yes, Barack Obama was president for 2 terms. But what happened in those 2 terms? Go and research how it affected Africans. How many projects by Europeans are being run in Africa for further militarization? And how does it not only affect the Africans on the African continent, but the Africans in the diaspora as well? So, and someone did ask a question about, this is why I said unity is important. Someone has posted a question about, Buganda has a lot to explain about the sad history of allying with Bazungus at the expense of Bunyoro. And there is a comment that one time Thomas Sankara was giving a speech at the UN, and this was in the light of what was happening with the Congo. And he said, as African people, we have to start to understand. He said, we have read our history, the positives and the negatives, and we accept it all. When you decide to know your history, we cannot still wait for ourselves generations over what already has happened to start digging and saying this person did this, that person did that. What is happening is to all of us. The political question is to all of us. That was done to make it harder for you guys to come and sit on a table. But the Europeans can sit on a table and decide what part is the British, what part is the Belgians, what part is the French. But you cannot even sit on a table to just decide we need to fight our unified oppressor, who is the European. So we need to start thinking about that. Let's accept our history for the negatives and the positives and stay on just keep focused. Because divide and rule was intentional. Divide and rule wasn't done just because the Buganda had any favor that the British wanted. The British didn't believe Buganda had any favor, to the point that when they came to Buganda and saw how Buganda was self-governed and running as a nation, they were like, Buganda can't do this. These are Negroes, man. They cannot do this. The Greeks came here and did this. But if you go back in history, everything that the Greeks said they did came from Kemet, Africa, came from the Moors, Africa. So let us not let them define how we act. That's the whole point of today's topic. They cannot whatever agreements we reached or talked about with the oppressor cannot define how we choose today to solidify our fight against oppression. It cannot dictate how we react. We're not reactionary. We're looking for revolution, which means systematic change. And agreements can be reached between nations on repercussions. I believe Uganda ought to pay DRC of Congo for the wars that have been put onto the DRC by Museveni. I did not do it. I do not support Museveni. I do not support Museveni's regime. But Ugandans who will exist in Uganda, however it might look like, hopefully in a federal state, ought to look to the rebuilding and to better relations with a neighbor state like the DRC. Those are just simple things. So when we start to actually doubt that we can unify as African people, because we have the same goals in mind, then we would have failed before we began. And when we start to put sentimental value, such as that act betrayed, like an act, for example, let me talk about. So there's the saying that, oh, the Buganda might not, again, the person commented that Buganda's questioned a lot on the point of unity. But I want to take us back to that time, and when Buganda as a nation agreed to, be a protectorate of the British, it was a few people who decided that that should be. And that happened and that passed. But that is not the whole. Buganda still is not existing the way it was. I don't know if I'm making a lot of sense. When it comes to the question of African unity, we should act like unity amongst indigenous African nations. We should stop looking at, because it didn't even just happen in Buganda itself. I've forgotten the name of this nation. We did a show on it on Zanji. I've forgotten the name of the nation, but it is the Amazonia fighters. They would go and capture people from other nations, African nations, into their enslavement. Actually, it wasn't even enslavement. Or when we look at it as enslavement, those are war criminals, like people who were stolen away from their land, abducted because of a war, because of militancy, and then shipped away to another continent. So they even participated in that, but they were doing it for their security. So we need to put things into the context that they are. As I said, once you start to decontextualize things, it becomes convenient to make assumptions like Buganda has no unity, or Buganda is suspected because of this and that. And it is those same assumptions that still have Museveni in power, that still cannot get Uganda's nations to come together as one and start to discuss about federacy. It is those assumptions of Obote was from Lango State, and they did this and this and that. They have no value for this and that. It is those assumptions that will not take us forward. But once we start to think about group survival and recognition of each other's indigeneity, we can start to actually look into our own liberation. So again, as we unwind this show and rewind and get to the end of what we're trying to discuss today, we started off with the idea of sentimental value versus group survival. I want us all to think about group survival. How do we survive as a group? Not only as Baganda, not only as Banyoro, but as African people. It is very important that we start to think of that, because Uganda did not exist before 1900. This Uganda we throw around might not even exist if we're not careful. You might find yourself in an East African Federation very soon, and in a country that's not called Uganda. Because the more of the history people don't know, and the more of the history people are distanced from, the easier it is. So we need to start to think about, because right now it's Project Erase. So we all see what happened with Rwanda. What happened after the genocide. The aftermath of that. The war that was waged by Kagame on the Hutus and not reported and talked about and not accounted for. The genocide that happened inside a genocide that is not talked about, that is not reported on. The erasure of indigeneity and the uplifting of nationality or nationalism that is still within the frameworks of colonization. We must start to look at rejecting nation states that have been imposed on us and start to identify with nation states that actually have root within us, and then let that be the foundation of your revolution. Only then will we start to understand the need for federalism, because then that brings in the unity amongst us as African people. Because at the end of the day, all African peoples, especially on the continent, must be unified if we're ever going to be serious about anti-imperialist struggle, if we're ever going to liberate ourselves as a people, if we're ever going to have any amount or ounce of self-governance, even at a national state level as Uganda, we should be able to say, no, Uganda is not the beginning of us all. We started from Buganda, we started from Acholi, we started from Lango. Why is that such a big problem that cannot be discussed in our politics? Why does that pose such a big threat to people who are in politics and supported by the US or Germany or the UK? And those are the colonizers. So I cannot say much more over this. I hope that, after today's show, we start to think about group survival. We start to think about where we attach sentimental value. We start to revisit our history. And also, if people are interested in the paper, please do comment now before I go off, so that I know to post it on our socials, so that you can have access to it. And sorry, I lost my thought, but again, as I had said before, and this is of utmost importance, this is very important. This has nothing to do with political actors. Because if we're talking about political actors, all of you at home watching, and I myself here speaking, in the space that I do take up, I do recognize the political actors, not as the people who wear suits and the politicians who, just go from wall A to wall B, stand up in parliament and smile and speak and then jump up in their high cars and drive home. The political actors are us, people who sit, who are at home, who are living, people who sell their food on the streets, people who run all the businesses in Uganda, people who participate in the nation. Those are the political actors. Until we recognize that the masses, the people, you are the political actors, and you're the ones who decide the political trajectory. The question is, do you choose revolution or reaction? Because we have been left to react, because it's easier to be left to react if a person of sentimental value is captured, as the Kabaka or the Sultan, and they're returned back to you with an agreement, of course, that you must sign, that doesn't give you the liberation you were looking for in revolutionary struggle. And these days we actually get given back nothing. Like the colonizer would give you an agreement to make it seem like they're trying. But with these dictators that we have in Museveni, we get nothing back. It's like, we didn't kill them. And you don't get everyone back. And you don't get any accountability for everyone who was involved. You just get the names that we know, the names that are on t-shirts, but how about the names that weren't on t-shirts? We get no accounting for everyone else involved. We hear from other people who are involved, other people who, were laid to rest because of the struggle. We don't even hear it from the so-called leaders' mouths. So, at the end of the day, or as we end our day and begin our day, we need to start rethinking who is a political actor and reckoning with the fact that being a politician or participating in the political field does not make you the only political actor. It so makes you a tool to be used by the political actors, a person to serve the political actors. You yourself, you're a political actor, but you rise to that position so that we use you as a tool while you're in that position. That is why Museveni has no shame to come and say, I do not serve you people. I serve me and my family. Because he recognizes that he's of no servitude. Because if anyone who occupied that space will know it's to serve. And if you're serving, that means the political actors are the masses, are the people. We send you to do what we want you to do. And when we demand, this is what's most important, when we demand and put pressure on the removal and the extraction of unitary governance and the recognition of indigenous nations in Uganda and the autonomy to be given back to these nations, only then can we actually start a revolution. Because everything else, arresting, giving us back, arresting and shipping others off, arresting and never mentioning who was gone, no tallies, no count, leave us as a state where we must just react. You know? All, every time a presidential candidate is arrested, you have Ugandans reacting. The Katikiro cannot be left to go somewhere. They're left at reacting, but they're reacting because they're tired. But the questions are deeper than just the Katikiro crossing. The questions are deeper than just Bobby Wine being in jail. The questions are deeper than just the hostage of 34 people. The questions are deeper than the arrest of Stella Nyanzi. People go and react because the questions are deeper than that. But then the political tools or the political participators who are meant to be a linkage of the people to that arena ought to recognize that and to use that and to sound off that, and not only ask for the release of these people, but ask for the deeper demands that the people are actually asking for. And if they're not ready to do that, the power remains in your hands to choose what trajectory this ought to go. Because if you're tired of reacting, start a revolution. That's how I'll end it today. Thank you so much for everyone who's been here. And as always, we do this every Sunday. At UNN, sorry about today. I think today I came a little bit late. But every Sunday, you can expect me with or without a guest. I'll be here. And if anyone has any questions, please do send them through in the next 2 to 3 minutes. But other than that, we will soon be leaving. And I want to wish all of you a good week. I know the week is just starting. Blessed week to all of you. And anyone, who's going through anything, I hope that you do reach where you want to be. I know, sometimes things might not be easy to go through them, easier said than done, but it will always end, And at the end of the day, we will reach to where we need to go. Because at the end of the day, no one is born a slave. No one has ever been born a slave. It is just an implantation that is planted in our minds as African people. Not only African people, but also so many other colonized peoples and peoples who have been enslaved before, that they were slaves in nature. But that cannot exist because no one is ever born enslaved to not only a person, but also a system. So if we decide, and we're adamant, and we have been adamant, people, remember, we have been adamant. I don't know what generation I am, but if we count from Kabaka Mwanga and, all my other lineages, because I'm mixed, I'm a generation of rejection of anti-imperialism. And I'm talking in 2022. But you might find that even at that time in 1800, Kabaka Mwanga was saying, no. Bana bazungu tebasobola kujja tufuga. And he had no guns. So remember, you are a product of rejection, of any subjugation. And you always understand that you were not born enslaved to anyone, not even a system. And it is within your nature. That's what's within your nature. But what's fabricated and put within nature is that you can be a slave to a system and someone, and the deification of someone else over you. But that is just a fabrication. The reality is you're a product of rejection, of any kinds of oppression. Not only 1,000 years ago, but years ago, and so many other years ago. So let's embrace the journey that has been taken by our ancestors. And let's take the journey to be made by us very seriously, because that is the future. Thank you for everyone who's been here. Until next Sunday, it's always a pleasure. And I want to wish everyone good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you might be. And the federal governors of indigenous African nations and the federal governors within Africa as a whole, and the unity of Africa still remains key to our liberation, to our emancipation, to building back of our nations, and to the future of what we can be. So good evening to everyone, and I hope that we all got something from today, but if we didn't, that we will get something throughout the week, because programs run throughout the week. So the best to everyone, and have a good evening.
Bantade, abalangira bantade mirembe. Kenzo mulangira suna tese akama walero. Ano kama, kabuliro yo kwenesiga. Akama, kagamba munago mwesigwa. Ano kama, kabuliro yo kwenesiga. Akama, kagamba munago mwesigwa. Abaganda twandizukukanga obudde butugeddeko, twandikuma lugo ebyaffe babitupako. Suuna waliwo abalyake bangi bentegeddeko, begobanye empologoma bagikutteko. Ebyabulungi mwasi babivanako, ante ekitambo ky'obunnanfuusi kyabatuulako. Ayaye omuntu wa wansi gwe bazanyirako, batulimba nti balina ke babala akaddako. Naye abagezigezi ng'omwana Kimbugwe Live yababuuka, ekimanya nti batusiba bbako. Keno revolution ikuzukusa bongo, bali batufera bali batufumba obongo. Befako boka, beyagaliza na boka, bebano bakalya boka. Bagisula beyambalira masuti, basiba mumpate nga bayiwa musimbi. Kye bali babala, gali malya nsibye ennyonyi bazifula taxi. Kala mazima twabesiga, twabawa obululu abaana bafa bangi basibwa. Amazima abalala bawangaluka, ulira bali ku mawange yo bavuya nsonga. Naye mwate ennaku z'omuli agenze nno manyizi baana, nalime wagonda wuya natera kugenda. Wonyingiriza ennyindo lindako ebinajja, naye bwenfuna federo nawo n'ebinajja. Kano kama, kabuliro yo kwenesiga. Kagamba munago mwesigwa. Kano kama, kabuliro yo kwenesiga. Kagamba munago mwesigwa. Kabaka wafa twetaaga kwanga mujeiko olabe bulene bweya. Munange luno lwoya lwa nnyindo nkubasamboko, waluganda yonna gy'oli kikukwatako. Wamma abaana b'e Bulaaya nammwe abaana ba Wakamba, kamba njagala tufuuke ekitole, tulwanire federo lyeko nange ndyeko. Ne kabaka waffe muwenda kyanonya. Wamma abaana b'engoma ndesakamba, balangira bambejja kakakamba. Mama abaana b'omusuka kakamba, mwe mulimu ekyama, omwava ekyama, engonge, enfumbe, olugambe, ensenene, ab'ekinyoma ekyama. Mulindwa kyambabulira mwenna abaana b'engabi, akama mukagabane n'abo abaana b'ekkobe n'enkimwe. Weddira namuŋŋoona oli wakasimba, ab'eddira enkula n'ab'enswaswa, ab'empologoma bafunye akama, n'abo abaana b'embubu bafunye akama, abaana b'empeewo kakakama, abakatimbu kakakama, ab'engona mmwe abaana b'enje akama mukabulira abo abaana b'ekibe, ab'embwa nammwe ab'ekibe akama mukakasuka eri mu baana b'envuma, abaana b'emmamba akama, mutima nenge waliwo akama, endiga enjovu kakakama, embuzi n'enjobe kakakama, engerebwe n'engeje kakama, obutiko n'akasange kakama. Wamma bekebuka akama mukagabane n'abenjaza, kuno amaaso gabacholi bagisu banyo batolo banyakole ati akama munanga akama mwena kama kemba gamba federo